All right, strap yourselves in, everyone, because today we are diving headfirst into the world of Dragonlance.
Oh yeah, Dragonlance, a classic.
We're tackling a treasure trove of your links on this one, and let me tell you, you guys did your homework. Some really fascinating stuff here.
It's a universe with a lot to unpack, that's for sure. You've got your D&D roots, then boom, novels, video games, even a cartoon. It's not every day you find a fictional world that hits it that big.
Absolutely. So let's not waste any time. We got to talk about Krynn. That's the actual world where Dragonlance takes place, right? What makes it so different from all those other fantasy worlds out there?
Well, first off, ditch those cookie-cutter elves and dwarves you see everywhere else. Krynn throws you a curveball right away with Kender.
Kender. Yeah, I've heard of these guys. They're the ones who can't keep their hands out of your pockets, right?
Exactly. Those mischievous little kleptomaniacs.
Hmm.
Love them or hate them, they definitely add some spice to the world. And then you've got your minotaurs.
Okay, minotaurs. Now, those are usually the bad guys, right? Big, hulking, labyrinth-dwelling monsters.
Not quite. Well, not just that anyway. In Krynn, minotaurs are much more nuanced. They've got their own complex society, their own culture. It's not just all horns and mazes with these guys.
I like it when a world flips the script like that. But we can't forget about the dragons themselves. I mean, it's IS called Dragonlance, after all. What makes the dragons in this world so special?
That's the thing, right? You don't often see worlds where good A&D bad dragons are both major players. You've got your classic chromatic dragons, your reds, your blues, all about that evil. But then you have the metallic dragons, gold, silver, fighting for good. Makes things a lot more morally complex than just good versus evil.
Way more interesting than everyone just picking a side, that's for sure. And speaking of sides, can we talk about the gods in Dragonlance? A single high god with 3 kids, good, evil, and neutral. Plus, there are moon gods specifically for wizards. What's up with that?
Yeah, the gods in Krynn are something else. That whole setup with the high god and his kids adds another layer to the world, And it ties directly into how the magic works, how the deities influence the world, like wizards drawing their power from different moons depending on their school of magic. Where else are you going to find that?
That's pretty wild.
And you can't really talk about Krynn without digging into its history, and I mean a lot of history. They have those legendary 5 ages, right?
5 whole ages. That sounds like a lot to cover.
It's basically like distinct chapters in the story of Krynn. You've got the first 2, the Age of Creation and the Age of Dreams. They're all about setting the scene, laying down the world's creation myth and the early civilizations. Interesting stuff, don't get me wrong, but not super critical to the popular Dragonlance stories.
So we can maybe skip ahead a bit.
Skip ahead, I like the way you think. So moving on the Age of Might, now we're talking. Picture this, a massive, catastrophic cataclysm that reshaped the entire world. Volcanoes blowing their tops, mountains crumbling, the whole 9 yards.
Talk about an environmental disaster. So that's what sets the stage for the Age of Despair. The name alone does not sound promising.
Despair might be an understatement.
Yeah.
This is when that famous War of the Lance happens, which is like the backdrop for a ton of the novels and games. We're talking gods getting directly involved, heroes facing impossible odds, just pure high drama on a global scale.
Now that's what I'm talking about. And finally, we get to the Age of Mortals. Is that where we are now? What makes that age so important?
Here's where Dragonlance really throws a curveball. See, after all the drama of the previous ages, the gods decide enough is enough and they bounce. No more divine intervention, no more godly guidance. The mortals are on their own.
Talk about tough love. It's like the gods are just like, all right, you're all grown up now. Figure it out yourselves.
Exactly. So the Age of Mortals is all about Krynn dealing with the fallout. What happens when the gods just peace out? How do people live, make choices without that divine guidance?
Heavy stuff, which maybe on a lighter note brings us to kind of the elephant in the room. We're talking about Dragonlances, the weapons. And I got to ask, are they as common as the series title makes it seem?
That's the funny thing. You'd think with a name like Dragonlance, those weapons would be everywhere, right?
Yeah, everyone's running around with one.
But in reality, they're more symbolic.
Yeah.
More like a representation of that whole struggle against evil.
So it's less about just like whipping out your trusty Dragonlance and more about their legendary significance? Makes sense? But for those of us who might not be totally familiar, what are Dragonlances?
Well, first of all, forget your average spear. These are holy weapons, specifically crafted, forged to slay dragons.
Right.
We're talking rare materials, divine blessings, the whole shebang.
The good stuff.
And here's a fun fact that come in 2 sizes. You've got your smaller ones for your average dragon slayer on foot, and then
Don't tell me.
a much larger version made for, wait for it, dragon riders.
Wait, hold up. Dragon riders using dragonlances to fight other dragons. Now that is a mental image.
It's peak Dragonlance, right? You've got this weapon that's steeped in mythology, designed for this one specific purpose, to take down these legendary creatures, and then you've got people riding dragons into battle with these things. It's epic.
My mind is officially blown. Okay, so we've got these legendary weapons, a world constantly on the brink of some kind of epic disaster, and enough dragons to fill the sky. What about the stories? Everyone always talks about the Dragonlance novels. What's the deal with those?
The novels. That's where Dragonlance really sinks its claws into you.
Yeah.
We're talking dozens upon dozens of books written by a whole bunch of different authors, but two names stand out: Margaret Weiss and Tracy Hickman.
I've definitely heard those names before.
They're the dynamic duo of Dragonlance, the OGs. The Chronicles trilogy, that's their baby. And it's the starting point for any Dragonlance newbie. It's your classic Fellowship of Heroes story, band of misfits comes together to save the world.
Sounds like my kind of story. But Chronicles aside, what other literary gems are hidden within this Dragonlance treasure trove?
Oh, we're just getting started. Weiss and Hickman also gifted us with the Legends trilogy. That one dives deep into the character of Raistlin.
Raistlin. Now there's a name that sparks some debate among the Dragonlance fans.
That's putting it mildly. Love him or hate him, you can't deny he's a fascinating character. He's not your typical goody two-shoes wizard. Ambitious, ruthless, walks a fine line between good and evil.
Morally gray characters always make things more interesting.
Right, and if you're craving even more War of the Lance action, there's the Lost Chronicles trilogy. Think of it like the director's cut of the Dragonlance saga. Fills in some gaps from the Chronicles trilogy, shows you events from different perspectives.
Like the behind-the-scenes bonus features for Dragonlance.
Exactly. You get a much deeper understanding of the War of the Lance, how it all went down.
So many books, so little time. Where does a reader even start with all of this?
That's the beauty of it. There's something for everyone. Whether you love epic battles, complex characters, or just exploring the ramifications of a world where the gods said, peace out, Krynn has something for you.
I like that. It's like choose your own adventure on a massive scale. But enough about us mortals for now. Let's talk dragons. Specifically, some of the more notable personalities we might encounter in our Dragonlance journey.
You want to talk dragons, you came to the right place. Krynn's got a whole horde of fascinating dragons, each with their own story to tell. But let's start with one who really challenges that whole idea of good and evil. Ski, the blue dragon who switched sides.
Ski, the turncoat dragon. What's his deal? Did he just wake up one morning and decide he didn't want to be blue anymore?
Uh-huh. Maybe he was just due for a wardrobe change. But seriously, Ski's story is a tragic one. He's a powerful blue dragon, so naturally he's aligned with the forces of evil during the War of the Lance. But then something happens.
He starts to question his loyalty. That's got to be a tough thing for a creature literally born of evil. What could possibly cause such a drastic change of heart?
It's the million-dollar question, right? Some folks think he was swayed by the heroic actions of the companions, especially Sturm Brightblade. Others believe it was his bond with Kitiara, who, despite being one of the baddies, had her moments of, let's call it, surprising compassion.
So maybe a sliver of good resided within her as well? Fascinating. But if I recall correctly, Sky's change of heart doesn't exactly end well, does it?
Sadly, no. It kind of makes you wonder if true redemption is even possible in a world as divided as Krynn. It's a question that comes up again and again in these stories.
Really makes you think. But let's maybe lighten the mood a bit and shift gears to a dragon with, well, less tragic feat. Silvara. Now she's one cool dragon.
Tilvara. Well, Silvara's story is fantastic. It's got everything: love, loyalty, elven magic, you name it. Plus, it ties directly into the history of the Qualinesti elves, one of the most prominent elven nations in Krynn.
Okay, you've piqued my interest. What's the connection between Silvara and these Qualinesti elves?
So picture this. Silvara is the sister of another very famous silver dragon named Gwyneth. You might have heard of her.
Hold on, the Gwyneth, as in human dragonbane's Gwyneth. Talk about a legendary duo.
The one and only. It seems that affinity for elves runs in the family, because Silvara also finds herself drawn to them. Specifically, to a Qualinesti elf named Gilthanas.
A dragon and an elf. Now that's what I call a power couple.
Right. But their story is more than just a subplot. Silvara plays a key role in several major events during the War of the Lance. She helps recover the Dragon Orb, which, if you're not familiar, is a seriously powerful magical artifact. Not only that, she uncovers a whole plot involving the theft of dragon eggs.
She sounds like a force to be reckoned with. Intelligent, compassionate, and clearly not afraid to get her claws dirty for a good cause.
She's definitely one of the good ones.
Which makes me wonder, who are the baddies? We've talked about Ski's redemption arc and Sylvar's heroism, but what about the villains? Who are the dragons everyone fears in Dragonlance?
Well, you can't talk about evil dragons without mentioning Meleys. She's the embodiment of ambition, a true testament to the corrupting nature of power.
Ugh, Meluses. The dragon who tried to become a god, now that's ambition. What was her deal? Was she just your typical power-hungry tyrant?
She makes your average power-hungry tyrant look like an amateur. We're talking next-level ambition here. See, Meleys is a red dragon, and she takes all those classic red dragon traits, the ambition, the lust for power, the need to dominate to a whole new level.
It's like she looked around at all the other powerful beings and thought, nah, I'm going for the top spot. I want to be a god.
Pretty much. Meleys was convinced that by seizing godhood, she could reshape all of Krynn in her image. And honestly, she almost pulled it off.
Seriously, how do you even begin to stop a dragon who's hell-bent on becoming a god?
It takes a truly legendary effort from a group known as the Heroes of the Heart. They confront Meleys in a battle that literally shakes the very foundation of Krynn. It's a showdown for the ages. And in the end, they manage to shatter her schemes, saving the world from what would have been a truly tyrannical reign.
Okay, now that is what I call an epic battle. And speaking of epic battles, we can't forget about those humanoid dragon creatures, the Draconians. What's their story?
Ah, the Draconians. A fascinating, and some might say, disturbing testament to the potential of magic in Krynn. Just picture it. A creature that combines the raw power of a dragon with a humanoid form, specifically created for war.
It's like something straight out of a nightmare. Who on earth would even think to create such a being?
Well, the masterminds behind these twisted creations are none other than Takesis and her minions. They needed a powerful army, one that was undeniably loyal and totally obedient. And what better way to achieve that than by corrupting the very essence of dragons themselves?
Talk about a terrifying display of power. But were all Draconians inherently evil? I mean, they were created from dragons, right? Did any of them retain a glimmer of their dragonic good?
It's actually more complicated than that. You see, initially, all Draconians were created using metallic dragon eggs, the good dragons. This ritual they used twisted the eggs, corrupted the dragons within. But as the war raged on and desperation set in, the forces of evil started using chromatic dragon eggs, the ones already aligned with evil.
And that's where things get really interesting, right?
Exactly. The Draconians born from those chromatic eggs, they were different. They became known as noble Draconians. And they possessed something truly unique, a spark of good within them.
Wow. Talk about a twist. It makes you wonder, is nature really stronger than nurture, even in a world as magically potent as Krynn? I can't imagine these noble Draconians had it easy.
Sadly, you're right. Most of them were killed soon after they hatched, seen as abominations by their own creators. Only a handful of them actually survived the war, and their fate after that remains a mystery. Makes you wonder what might have been if they had been given a chance, to explore that flicker of good within them.
Now, that's a story I'd love to hear, but we've got to save some of these dragon tales for another time. Speaking of which, it looks like we've got just enough time for one more dragon deep dive before we move on. And the name that's really jumping out at me is Scion Bloodbane. He just sounds like trouble.
Scion Bloodbane. Oh, he's a piece of work, that one. A green dragon known for his cunning and his love of a good scheme. This wasn't your typical smash first, ask questions later kind of dragon. Scion Bloodbane, he was a mastermind. We're talking mentally enslaving King Caledon and even creating his own realm of nightmares.
Hold on. Creating a nightmare realm? This dragon was playing 4D chess while everyone else was stuck on checkers? He sounds more like a master manipulator than a brute.
Exactly. Scion Bloodbane understood that true power often lies in the shadows. He was a student of magic, mentored by some of the best, including the infamous Galen Dracos.
So not just brawn, but brains, too. A deadly combination. But even masterminds make mistakes, right? How does a dragon this cunning meet his end?
Well, as is often the case, it was his own hubris that brought him down. He got a little too confident, a little too sure of himself. While he was busy trying to infiltrate and ultimately destroy the Sylvanesti elves, he underestimated his enemies.
Don't tell me he was defeated by Ella.
A volley of well-aimed arrows, believe it or not.
No way. The mighty Scion Bloodbane, brought down by arrows.
It just goes to show that even the most powerful creatures have their weaknesses.
It seems even dragons can't escape the pointy end of a well-aimed shot. Speaking of which, let's shift our aim to our next topic, Dragonlance's lasting impact on the world of gaming. But first, a quick break to catch our breath. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back.
It's more than just an impact, though, right? I mean, Dragonlance basically defined a whole generation of RPGs. Think about it, before Krynn, most fantasy settings were pretty generic. They didn't have that same depth, that rich lore that players were looking for. Dragonlance changed all that.
Yeah, it's kind of wild when you think about it. A bunch of friends sitting around a table, rolling dice, letting their imaginations run wild, and boom, they spark this whole phenomenon.
It's the magic of tabletop gaming, right?
Absolutely. But let's get into the specifics. For those of us who maybe missed out on those early days of Dragonlance gaming, where do we even begin?
Every Dragonlance gaming pilgrimage has to start with Dragons of Despair. That's the granddaddy of them all, the one that kicked it all off.
Dragons of Despair, released back in 1984.
That's the one. And it was more than just a game. It was like a portal, transporting players to this incredible world on the brink of war.
Now, you say it was more than a game, but it was a game, right? A tabletop RPG.
Right, but it was the first of its kind in a lot of ways. See, Dragons of Despair was a module.
Module. Okay, for those of us who might not be familiar with the lingo, what exactly does that mean?
Good call. So, in the world of tabletop RPGs, a module is basically a pre-designed adventure, like a story template that the dungeon master or the DM can use to run the game.
So, Dragons of Despair provided the framework for players to actually experience the world of Krynn firsthand.
Exactly. It threw players headfirst into the War of the Lands, gave them the chance to fight alongside those legendary heroes, Tanis Half-Elven, Flint Fireforge, the whole gang.
What was it like playing those early modules? I imagine it was pretty different from the polished RPG experiences we have today.
It's like comparing those old-school Star Wars movies to the CGI extravaganzas they're putting out these days.
The special effects might not hold up, but man, those original movies had soul.
Exactly. And Dragons of Despair, it had that same impact. It wasn't just about the mechanics of rolling dice and fighting monsters. It was about the story, the characters, the feeling that you were a part of something truly epic.
So Dragons of Despair kind of set the standard, and then the floodgates opened. More Dragonlance games, more adventures in Krynn.
Oh yeah, it was just the beginning. You had Dragonlance Adventures, which was basically a treasure trove of lore and game mechanics, specifically designed for dungeon masters who wanted to create their own campaign set in Krynn.
So this wasn't about following a preset story. This was about giving dungeon masters the tools they needed to create their own Dragonlance sagas.
Exactly. It was a goldmine for anyone who loved the world-building aspect of RPGs. You wanted to know about Krynn's history, its cultures, religions, magic systems. Dragonlance Adventures had you covered.
I can definitely see the appeal, but Dragonlance didn't just stick with the same old formula, right? Didn't they shake things up in the Fifth Age?
Ah, the Fifth Age. A time of innovation. And maybe a few creative differences, let's say. This was when Dragonlance made a pretty bold move. They stepped away from the familiar Dungeons & Dragons system and adopted the Saga system instead.
The Saga system. Okay, now that might be a new one for some of our listeners. What was the reasoning behind ditching D&D?
It was a gamble for sure, but sometimes you got to roll the dice and see what happens, right?
Yeah.
So the Saga system, it used cards instead of dice, and it was designed to be faster, more streamlined.
Less dice rolling, more card playing. That is a pretty big change. How did the fans react?
It was a mixed bag, honestly. Some people loved it. They praised its innovative approach to combat, the way it emphasized storytelling. Others, well, they missed their dice.
I imagine change is never easy, especially when you're talking about something as beloved as Dragonlance.
Exactly. And this whole shift ultimately led to a parting of ways between Dragonlance and D&D.
A parting of ways, as in a breakup. This sounds serious.
It was a big deal in the RPG world. When Wizards of the Coast, they're the ones who own D&D now, when they acquired TSR, which is the company that originally published Dragonlance, control of the Dragonlance setting went to Margaret Weiss.
Wow. Talk about a turning point. It makes you wonder what might have happened if Dragonlance had stayed within the D&D fold. Would things have been different?
It's one of those what-if scenarios that keeps Dragonlance fans up at night, but it also says a lot about the enduring legacy of this world, right? Even when it went its own way. It did it with that same spirit of creativity and innovation that drew people to it in the first place.
It's like they say, sometimes you have to forge your own path. Speaking of forging paths, we've got to talk about Dragonlance's forays into the world of video games. I have such fond memories of playing Heroes of the Lance back in the day. It wasn't perfect, but for its time, it was a surprisingly faithful adaptation of the book.
It really did capture the spirit of the Chronicles trilogy, putting players right in the middle of all the action. Though, if we're being honest, the NES version, let's just say it's achieved legendary status for all the wrong reasons.
Yes, it's become one of those so bad it's good classics, hasn't it?
Exactly. But hey, you can't deny that nostalgia factor.
And not at all. But Heroes of the Lance, it was just the tip of the iceberg, right? Didn't they release a sequel?
Oh yeah, you're thinking of Dragons of Flame. Tried to recapture that magic of the original, but it definitely had some mixed results. And then there was War of the Lance. Now that one was ambitious. They tried to translate that epic scale of the Dragonlance saga into a top-down strategy game.
War of the Lance. Now that one I vaguely remember. It was ahead of its time, wasn't it?
Definitely ahead of its time. It had some genuinely innovative ideas for strategy games, but it just didn't quite click with players back then.
It's a shame because looking back, it had the potential to be something truly special, but hey, you've got to give Dragonlance credit for trying new things, pushing boundaries. And speaking of pushing boundaries, we can't wrap up the stripped down memory lane without mentioning that cartoon.
Yes. The Dragonlance cartoon.
Yeah.
The one we don't talk about.
It's like that one relative we try to avoid at family gatherings.
You said it, not me.
Yeah.
But in all seriousness, it's a shame what happened with that cartoon. It had so much potential, but somewhere along the way, it just went off the rails.
What went wrong?
Where do we even begin? The animation was interesting, to say the least. The story felt rushed, like they were trying to cram an entire novel's worth of plot into a handful of episodes. And the voice acting, while it had some big names attached, it just felt off.
It's a classic case of too much too soon, trying to force a sprawling epic into a format that just couldn't contain it.
Exactly. It's a shame because the foundation was there. You had a beloved fantasy world, a compelling story, a talented cast. But sometimes, no matter how much you want it to work, some things just don't translate well from one medium to another.
It's a good reminder that even in a world of magic and dragons, not every adventure is destined for legendary status. But hey, maybe someday someone will give it another shot, right? Bring Dragonlance to the big screen, but this time with a little more finesse, a little more care.
We can always dream. Until then, we'll just have to keep those well-worn copies of the Chronicles trilogy close at hand and let our imaginations take us back to Krynn.
And on that note, let's take a short breather to gather our thoughts and prepare for the final leg of our Dragonlance journey. We'll be back shortly to talk about the Dragonlances themselves, and I do mean the weapons this time, not the series. And we're back, ready to talk about some serious dragon-slaying hardware.
About time, right? We've covered those who wield the weapons, the dragons they're meant to fight, but the Dragonlances themselves, they've almost been lurking in the background this whole time.
It's true. They're almost more like a legend, right? A symbol.
Exactly. A symbol of hope when all seems lost, you could say. But that doesn't mean we can't geek out about the actual weapons a little bit.
Oh, absolutely. So let's talk specifics. What sets a Dragonlance apart from, say, your run-of-the-mill dragon-slaying sword or a magic axe?
Oh, we're talking different leagues here. Forget enchanted this or magically forged that. Dragonlances are practically in a class by themselves.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
These aren't just weapons, right? They're holy artifacts, consecrated, blessed by the gods themselves. This isn't your village blacksmith whipping these up.
So there's like a whole ritual involved then. You're not just buying these at the magic item shop.
I got it. Crafting a Dragonlance, it's this whole process steeped in tradition, rare materials, ancient rituals, blessings from the powers that be, the whole 9 yards. It really shows you how seriously they take the whole dragons are a threat thing in Krynn.
Makes sense. You don't just slap together a Dragonlance for your average Tuesday dragon hunt. So walk us through it. What goes into actually making one of these things?
Well, the exact details, they're kind of shrouded in myth and legend, you know. But from what we've pieced together, each lance is forged with specific metals, gemstones, all chosen for their magical properties, and then imbued with powerful enchantments. It's not a one-person job either. You've got master artisans, each at the top of their game, working together in some sacred space, pouring their skill into this weapon.
It sounds more like crafting a religious relic than a weapon of war.
There's definitely a spiritual element to it, for sure. And don't forget, these aren't just any lances. Remember we talked about earlier, the whole two sizes thing.
Oh, right. So you've got the smaller Dragonlance for your everyday dragon slayer who's on foot, maybe horseback. But then you have
The big guns, literally. Those massive lances made specifically for, wait for it, The dragon riders.
Dragon riders, using dragon lances to fight other dragons. It's almost too cool to handle.
That's Dragonlance for you. You've got these epic battles happening in the sky, dragons clashing, fire everywhere, and in the middle of it all, you've got these warriors riding dragons, wielding weapons specifically designed to bring down their own kind.
The mental image alone is enough to give you chills, and it really highlights how complex the whole dragon situation is in Krynn, right? It's not just a simple dragons are evil, end of story kind of deal.
Yeah, exactly. It's more nuanced than that. Dragons are a force of nature, both destructive and, in some cases, benevolent. And the Dragonlances themselves, they kind of represent that duality. They're powerful tools for good, but they're also a stark reminder of the potential for destruction that dragons represent, and the lengths that mortals have to go to in order to keep that destruction in check.
Man, when you put it like that, you really get a sense of the weight of responsibility that must come with wielding a Dragonlance. This isn't just some magical sword you pick up and swing around. It's a commitment to something bigger, a dedication to protecting the world from chaos.
100%. To wield a Dragonlance, it means something. It says, I'm willing to stand against impossible odds to fight for what's right, even if it means facing down a creature of legend.
Chills. That's what I love about Dragonlance. It takes these classic fantasy tropes, dragons, knights, epic quests, and it infuses them with this incredible depth that makes you think, makes you feel.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
And on that note, I think it's time we wrap up our Dragonlance deep dive. We've traveled through time, faced terrifying dragons, and even delved into the world of tabletop gaming, all through the lens of this incredible fantasy universe. It's been a wild ride.
We barely even scratched the surface. There are so many more stories to tell, so many corners of Krynn left to explore. Who knows, maybe we'll find ourselves back here someday for another deep dive.
I'm always up for a good adventure. But until then, dear listeners, it's time to say farewell. Keep exploring those fantastical worlds. And remember, sometimes the most powerful weapon you have is the courage to face your dragons head on.